Dear viewers, I am Professor Sharanjeet, working at the Rajiv Gandhi National University of Law, Punjab. In today's lecture, we shall talk about the international prison reform movements. The persons lodged in prisons are also as human as all of us. Unfortunately, history is a witness to the fact that in primitive times, prisons, gaols, or penitentiaries, as they were referred to, were dark, dingy places that witnessed the harrowing experiences of those incarcerated. Is the objective of prisons merely confinement? Wagnitz had argued that while the security of the state may be the principal object of criminal law, that very security could also be promoted by reforming the criminal. Cesare Beccaria, an Italian jurist and philosopher, believed that the purpose of punishment was to prevent the offender from committing the crime again and discourage others from even committing it. He said that the right to punish does not extend to the right to kill. He emphasized the importance of humane punishment within the criminal justice system. He argued against techniques that involved excessive torture or the death penalty. He authored an essay on crimes and punishment. Dear viewers, now we shall focus on the historical context in this regard. From the historical context, it can be gauged that prison or a gaol, as it was called in ancient and primitive times, sent shock waves as it reflected a place with complete disregard for the human rights. As discussed in the previous lectures, in primitive times, there was no concept of a prison the way we have in the modern times. Some specific places of forts and castles were often used for the purpose of incarcerating the wrongdoers. Hence, there was no formal prison structure. The conditions of the prison inmates were deplorable, they were denied the basic human rights, and there was no classification on the basis of gender, age, or the nature of the offence committed. Furthermore, the prisoners were not only put in solitary confinement, but they were also made to do harsh physical labor, which was often of a very mechanical nature, like working on the treadmill or the crankshaft. With the passage of time, thinkers and philosophers throughout the world, particularly in the 18th century, started thinking about reforming the conditions of the people confined to jails, gaols, or penitentiaries, as they were popularly called during those times. The criminals were made to undergo solitary confinement with no social interaction at all for repentance and purification of the soul. However, in reality, solitary confinement led to mental disease, illness, and disorders among the inmates. Gradually, people started voicing their concerns about the inhumane existence behind the four walls of the jail. Death due to illness and disease was also very common among the prisoners. There was an emergence of new social scientific ideas and a progressive era that tried to pinpoint the availability of basic necessities in prisons, the classification of the prisoners, the architecture of the prisons, hygiene in prisons, and the productivity of the prisoners by way of the nature of the work performed by them. But this did not happen overnight. Tireless efforts were made by the prison reformers in different parts of the world which eventually paved the way for human rights of the prisoners. Now we shall study some prominent prison reformers who paved the way for a global endeavor for a better life within the four walls of a jail and the protection of human rights and dignity of the prison inmates. We shall start with John Howard. One of the most notable prison reformers is John Howard. In the United Kingdom, Howard conducted an extensive study and tour of the prisons and gave meaningful suggestions to reform the prisons. In 1773, he was appointed as the High Sheriff of Bedfordshire County. As a part of his duties, he was also required to inspect the county jails. He travelled extensively to understand the prison system. Through his works and extensive travels, he could understand the condition of prisons in those times. In 1777, John Howard published a book advocating the improvement of conditions in the prisons. It was an important book and some of its recommendations were also accepted. Consequently, the Howard League for Penal Reform was named after John Howard. He did research across various prisons in the United Kingdom and gave a report. The major findings or observations made by John Howard were that the prisoners were not separated by gender or types of crime committed by them. The prison conditions were so inhumane that prisoners were dying due to illness, the jailers were corrupt, and life inside the prison was full of miseries. He made several recommendations like running water in the jails, clean and hygienic conditions, access to medical treatment, improvement in the standard of food, payment to the jailers, and regular visits from churchmen. Now we shall focus on the works of Jeremy Bentham. It is significant to note that Jeremy Bentham also influenced prison structure and administration. He designed prison structures in such a way that maximum surveillance was possible with the least number of jail warders. The building with the prisoners is only one cell thick and every cell has one open side facing the central tower. This one side has bars over it but is otherwise entirely exposed to the tower. The guards can thus see the entirety of any cell at any time and the prisoners are always vulnerable and visible. Conversely, the tower is far enough from the cells and has sufficiently small windows that the prisoners cannot see the guards inside of it. The sociological effect is that the prisoners are aware of the presence of the authority at all times, even though they never know exactly when they are being observed. Next, we shall focus on Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth Fry was an English prison reformer. She is also called the Angel of Prisons. She started with an experiment in the Newgate prison as she was horrified by the conditions there during those times. This is also called the Newgate experiment. She started the Newgate experiment with the help of 12 volunteers who regularly visited the women prisoners at Newgate. The group strived hard to protect the female prisoners, helped in setting up a school for the prison children, and also founded the Association for the Prison of the Female Prisoners at Newgate in 1817. Elizabeth Fry and her association also proposed the Newgate rules. It is important to note that she played an instrumental role in the Guilds Act of 1823 with regards to the classification of prisoners on the basis of gender and the provision of female warders for female inmates. Elizabeth Fry had also documented that due to the non-classification of prisoners, the female prisoners had to bear sexual exploitation in the prisons. It is interesting to note that she was depicted on the Bank of England £5 note as a mark of respect for her work for the female prisoners in the United Kingdom. She and her association worked tirelessly to improve the condition of female prisoners. She promoted the idea of rehabilitation for prisoners instead of harsh punishments, and also provided work for the female inmates inside the prisons to develop skills such as needlework and knitting. She gave evidence to Select Committee of the House of Commons in 1818. Later on, she also gave evidence to a Select Committee of the House of Lords in 1835 with regards to the prisons in England and Wales. From historical text, it can be inferred that the condition of the women prisoners who were transported was pitiable. Elizabeth Fry also initiated a movement for the abolition of transportation. She also authored a book, Prisons in Scotland and the North of England, where she highlighted the conditions of the prisoners. There is no denying the fact that Elizabeth Fry became the voice of many female prisoners. Dear viewers, now we shall focus on the reforms brought by George O. Paul. George O. Paul was appointed as High Sheriff of Gloucestershire in the fall of 1780. He was greatly impressed by the writings of John Howard. He endeavoured to improve the conditions in prisons in the UK. Through his writings, he tried to put forward the difference between convicted prisoners and those under trials who were merely arrested on suspicion. He aimed to set up new prisons and also improve the conditions of the already existing prisons. He gave detailed rules for regulating life inside the prisons. Some of the prominent writings by him are as follows: Thoughts on the Alarming Progress of the Guel Fever, 1784. Considerations on the Defects of Prisons, 1784. Address to the Magistrates of Gloucestershire at the Michaelmas Quarter Session, 1789. Proceedings in the Construction and Regulation of the Prisons and Houses of Correction in the County of Gloucestershire, 1810. Dear viewers, it is interesting to note that George O. Paul obtained a special Act of Parliament and himself designed a county jail at Gloucestershire. This building, which opened in 1791, had a chapel, a dispensary, a ward, and workrooms. Hence, the jail was designed keeping in mind the reformation of the offender. Next is John T. Burt. John Burt also worked towards better living conditions for the jail inmates. He authored Results of the System of Separate Confinement as Administered at the Pentonville Prison, 1852, and this was a comprehensive study that dealt with the separate system at Pentonville in London. John Burt is said to be the founder of this system, in which prisoners were kept in solitary cells and their communication was limited. In contrast to the silent system, where the prisoners were not allowed to communicate at all, this system was an improvement as it lowered recidivism but also helped in retaining humanism. This system also helped in preventing idleness among the inmates. Next in the line is Dorothea Lynde Dix. Dix was an American who worked for the mentally ill. She was instrumental in the founding or expansion of more than 30 hospitals for the treatment of the mentally ill. She was moved by the inhumane treatment of insane and mentally disturbed persons who were incarcerated with criminals, irrespective of their age or gender. Such mentally challenged inmates were incarcerated in the most inhumane conditions. They were often chained to the walls, and there was a lack of sanitary facilities and even basic clothing. In 1843, she submitted to the Mascots legislature a detailed report of documented findings. In 1845, she published Remarks on Prisons and Prison Discipline in the United States. Her efforts paved the way for separate institutions and treatments for mentally ill people. Dear listeners, now we shall study the works of Zebulon Reed Brockway. Brockway has greatly contributed to the American prison system's reform. He authored 50 Years of Prison Service, an autobiography. He started his career as a prison guard in Weatherfield, Connecticut in 1848. During his official tenure, he worked at various posts in the prison department. He worked towards prison reforms, and his major contribution was the concept of indeterminate sentencing. He advocated for a program of education for the inmates, physical activity for them, and training in useful trades. He was of the view that the aim of prisons was to rehabilitate, not simply punish the wrongdoers. He advocated education for prisoners, particularly those who were between 16 and 21 years of age. This concept was introduced at the Elmira State Reformatory in 1876. In the Elmira Reformatory, the prisoners worked during the day and received education as well as vocational training. The prisoners were also given points for their good behavior inside the prisons, and earning sufficient points led to their early release. This led to the classification of the prisoners. They were given individualized treatment, and the main emphasis was on skill development and behavior transformation. Good behavior by the inmates was rewarded. The seeds of the modern system of parole could also be said to have been sown during those times. However, this system was also criticized as being highly disciplinary and harsh, where the prisoners were given strict punishments for violating the rules. Now we shall understand the works of Alexander McConkie. McConkie was a prison reformer, and he introduced the mark system. In 1840, he became the governor of Norfolk Island. Upon reaching the island, he started working for prison rehabilitation. On Norfolk Island, he applied the mark system. He returned to the United Kingdom in 1844 and later published a book emphasizing this system. In 1849, he was appointed governor of the new prison at Birmingham. His major publication was Criminal Statistics and Movements of the Bond Population of Norfolk Island to December 1843. The mark system, as mentioned above, reduced idleness in prisons. Incentives were given to work and maintain good behavior, and self-discipline was inculcated through this system. The prisoners were allowed to spend their earned marks on food and other things. It was equally applicable to men and women. Under this system, the prisoners were held until they had earned a number of marks fixed in proportion to the seriousness of their offense. and a prisoner became eligible for release when he had earned a sufficient number of marks, which were collected by his good conduct, work, and study during the phase of incarceration. However, the marks were subtracted for any misbehavior or misconduct by the prisoner. His two basic principles of prison administration were as follows. Punishment should benefit both the victim and the society. Punishment should not be vindictive but aim for the reform of the convict through observance of social conduct. And secondly, a convict imprisoned should be entrusted with work, and his release from prison must be dependent upon a measurable amount of labor undertaken by him during his confinement. Dear listeners, next is Sir Walter Crofton. Crofton is known for the Irish system. In this Irish system, the prisoners progressed through 3 stages of confinement before they were finally released to the society. It is interesting to note that the first stage of the sentence was served in isolation. In the second stage, the prisoners were assigned to group work projects, and in the last stage, for 6 months or more before their release from the prison, the prisoners were transferred to intermediate prisons where they were given sufficient freedom and responsibility to demonstrate their fitness for release from the prisons. The Irish penal system later influenced the penal systems of other countries as well. In this system, the prisoners were classified into groups. In this system, the concept of intermediate prisons was also introduced. This method also emphasized individualization and rehabilitation of the criminals through proper supervision. The system prepared for the release of the prisoner in an open society and made concrete efforts to reduce the rates of recidivism. Next, we shall study William Penn. Penn was the founder and governor of the Pennsylvania colony. He abolished capital punishment for all crimes except murder and treason. He also advocated for work by the prisoners. He was of the view that a prison could serve as an instrument for reformation. He was also a Quaker. He was of the view that the prisoner should be dealt with humanely and should be reformed during the prison term. He founded his own correctional philosophy, which also helped sow the seeds for future correctional administration worldwide. He believed in the respect and dignity of the prison inmates. The Quakers movement is also very crucial with regards to prison reforms. As per available literature, the Quakers movement originated in England during the mid-17th century. The Quakers advocated for the inherent dignity and worth of every individual. They rejected social hierarchies and consequent discrimination. They believed in simplicity, peace, service, and equality. With the passage of time, the Quaker movement also spread to the United States. They were first formed as a religious society of friends. The general population came to know about the bad state of the prisons, as most of the Quakers were imprisoned at some point of their lives. The Quakers were of the view that the prisoners were to be rehabilitated and should not be subjected to violence or inhumane conditions. In the Quaker-led movements, people raised their voices for prison reforms and ending capital punishment. It is important to note that in the 18th and 19th centuries, both in England and the United States, the conditions of the prisons were not good. The Quakers' reform movement aimed at humanizing the prisons. The Quakers opposed the death penalty. They advocated for prison visitation, better conditions in prisons, education, prison expansion, and the classification of prisoners. Elizabeth Fry was also a Quaker who advocated for the rights of women prisoners. It is important to note that the silent system of incarceration was also proposed by the Quakers. They were of the view that solitary confinement would eventually lead to repentance. It fostered penitence and thereby encouraged the reformation of the wrongdoer. Gradually, it was seen that the Quaker movement for prison reforms influenced the development and construction of prisons, the classification of prisoners, the separate confinement of women prisoners, solitary confinement in place of the death penalty, and the dignity of the prisoners. The concept of asylum as a separate place for the mentally ill and rehabilitation of the prisoners was also introduced due to the Quakers movement. Many Quaker women also raised their voices regarding the female prisoners. They advocated for the segregation of male and female prisoners. Female prisoners to have female wardens, skill development among the female inmates for a better life after release from the prisons. In the end, I would like to conclude, the current era of correctional administration was possible only due to the untiring efforts of great men and women who believed in the dignity of even a wrongdoer. I would like to conclude with an observation by Beccaria. The end of punishment is no other than to prevent the criminals from doing further injury to the society and to prevent others from committing the like offense. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Thank you very much.